We'll move over to nature recovery in the National Park, and to present that is our Senior Wildlife Conservation Officer, Tony Sargent. So with that, I'll hand over to Tony.
What I'm going to try and do is essentially present the same talk that I gave to a meeting of the full authority a few weeks ago about nature recovery plan. A few things taken out, a few things added. So what we're going to do, as I say, as a double act, Rebecca's going to share her screen. I'm going to talk to the slides, and I'm going to ask Rebecca to move on when we've covered a particular slide. So you should be, if everything's going according to plan, looking at a slide of a curlew. So can I have the next slide, please? So essentially this is a slide that is really about how we got to where we are with the nature recovery plan. Last year, members of the National Park Authority asked us to go away and prepare a nature recovery plan, working with the Biodiversity Forum. We have 3 land management forums that advise the National Park, the Biodiversity Forum being one of them. We have a farming and land management forum, and we have a trees and woodland forum. And we were asked, all 3 forum essentially, to go away and to prepare a plan for nature recovery. On the 25th of September this year, we presented the plan which the Biodiversity Forum and the other forums had drawn up, and after a discussion at full authority meeting, it was endorsed by the National Park Authority. And the reason why this was started a year ago was because we are aware that there will be these statutory documents produced at a county level, which are called local nature recovery strategies. And there'll be one for North Yorkshire, there'll be one for Cumbria, and there'll be one for Lancashire. And the nature recovery plan was produced in order to feed into all 3 of these statutory documents and try and influence them so that the National Park's perspective is taken into account properly in those plans. Can I have the next slide, please? So why do we need a nature recovery plan? Because the whole idea of recovery suggests there's a problem in the first place. Actually, it was the day after we presented this at full committee. There was a report produced by the country's leading nature conservation NGOs called State of Nature, and it made for sober reading because it revealed a situation. They'd looked at all the records, past records of 10,000 species going back to the 1970s, and what they concluded from that study was that something like an average of 19% of species have declined over that time. Nearly 1 in 6 species are at some risk of extinction, and since 1500, the year 1500, 151 species have actually gone extinct. Well, you might say in 500 years and only 151 species, that's quite good going. But actually, when you look at the rates over time, as far as we can tell, that's a very high extinction rate, and it is something of a cause for concern. So can I have the next slide, please? So that's the national picture. What's happening in the Dales? Well, I'd like to say yes or no, but it's actually a bit of a mixed picture. For some years, we've been doing a trends and status report, which is, if you like to view it this way, it's our version of State of Nature. And in 2020 was the last one that we produced, and we found that 76% of the species we were following were in populations that were stable or increasing, which is good news, except if you reflect on that, that means a quarter of them were in populations that were actually declining. And the target we'd set ourselves was a 95% of those populations being in good condition. So it wasn't the best news. Anyway, there are winners and losers. If I could have the next slide, please. So between 2000 and 2020, a number of species increased. The populations appear to increase, and I've got some pictures of some of those. I won't go into detail about exactly what they all are, but interesting. One of them on that picture is probably people know is hen harrier, which has become re-established in the national park as a breeding bird. Next slide, please. And then there are a number of key species that we recognise as being in what we think are stable populations, and that isn't that's no mean achievement when you consider that things like the curlew in the middle there have actually declined over most of the UK, and the Northern Pennines, including Yorkshire Dales, are now the national stronghold, certainly in England, for the species. Have the next slide, please. Nevertheless, there's a number of species that have shown marked declines in the 20 years. I've got some pictures of some of them on there. Yellow wagtail, juniper, white-clawed crayfish, field gentian. Disturbingly, there's twice as many species that are in this decreasing category than are in the increasing category. We've been asked to talk about invasive non-native species during the forum. The white-clawed crayfish there at the bottom left-hand corner is a classic example of a native species that's being displaced and is under threat because of the spread of a non-native species, the American signal crayfish. And the American signal crayfish arrives here bringing crayfish plague, which has been responsible for decimating the populations in the River Ure, which was a national stronghold, but there's been some terrific declines. So the next slide is on invasive non-native species, and these are some of the species we didn't have in the national park, because there is some evidence that they threaten the native biodiversity. Some are a greater threat than others. I've mentioned the signal crayfish, which is the one middle top showing the red claws, but also grey squirrel, for example, to the left of it, which is displacing and also bringing in another disease which threatens the native red squirrel populations. So I can answer some questions if people have them on invasive non-native species later on and what we're doing, what the threats are. But in general, next slide, please. What can we do to recover nature? At the turn of the last century, the answer seemed obvious. We create lots of nature reserves, and I suppose one of the pioneers of that was Charles Rothschild. Well, I guess if you're a Rothschild, you can buy lots of land and set up lots of nature reserves. And that's what happened during the 20th century. Is there were a lot of nature reserves and such like set up. So it's halted the decline to somewhat. If I can have the next slide. However, what it's tended to do is it's created a landscape where we've got dotted about the landscape. We've got some rather good sites for nature in the midst of a sea of land that's either indifferent or hostile to nature. And so at the beginning of this century, the government commissioned a report by John Lawton, became Sir John Lawton. He's now president of Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, actually, to see how we could address the problem. And he came up with the terminology more, bigger, better, and more joined up. And that essentially sums up the Lawton principles for what we're trying to achieve for nature recovery. So next slide, I think, is an interesting one, because it actually shows all the key priority habitats that we're aware of in the Yorkshire Dales National Park. And actually, we're pretty well off for priority habitat. 86,000 hectares is some 10% of all the priority habitat in all of England's 44 protected landscapes. And this map shows where they all are. And they're quite well joined up already and not so fragmented as they are in other parts of the country. By the way, this map you can find on the authority website, and it's available for anyone to go on and have a look to see, what's on their land, whether it's priority habitat or what have you. Anyway, if I could have the next slide. Going back to the nature recovery plan, again, you will be able to find the nature recovery plan on the authority website, but essentially it's a document that has divided the national park, its priority habitats, up into 5 categories, and for each of them tries to work out ways that we could establish better functioning, better connected networks of those habitats. And if I have the next slide, please. We've set some objectives for creating and restoring important habitats for 20,000 hectares of habitat creation or restoration, protecting or enhancing 1,000 kilometres of rivers and streams, and 250 kilometres of species-rich hedgerows to help connect all of that up. And we think those are ambitious yet realistic targets, but we recognise we possibly could go even further than that if we had the full weight of the government behind us and the resource put into the national parks. If I can have the next slide, please. I wanted to dwell on one of those priority habitats, the rivers, because I know there was a forum, some questions about the state of the river systems. In 2020, remember the Trends and Status report I spoke about earlier, it seemed to say that our river systems were in a good state ecologically, 62% rated as high or good by the Environment Agency. That compares, and that was an increase on when it had previously been measured in 2010. And when you look at the national average just being 14%, it does indicate that we're probably in a good state as regards rivers in the national park. And just to explain how the rivers are assessed, their ecological status is under several categories. And for example, the river cover, I've given an example, is rated good for its biology and hydromorphology, and even better for its physicochemical and pollutant status. If I could have the next slide. The Nature Recovery Plan also deals with species, and we have identified 394 species of conservation concern in the national park. We've categorised them. We've tried to work out what the best approach to their conservation is. There are some which we've identified. Thankfully, a relatively small number of those 394 need very specific bespoke action. We think that there is a whole category of species that if we simply look after the habitat, they can be conserved by looking after the habitat alone. You'll notice that category 3 is probably the largest category, which is the one that we don't know sufficient about in order to work out what the best approach is. So there is a research and development need as well that we've identified from the Nature Recovery Plan. So if we go on to the next slide, this is an example of what I think is a good category 2 species, which is one that if we get the management of the moorlands right, then birds, which ground nesting birds like the golden plover, are going to thrive and do well. And thankfully, there are a lot of ground nesting birds that are doing well, but we are losing birds like yellow wagtail, another ground nester, which is probably an example of a category 1 where we need to do some bespoke action. Another good example of a category 1 species is probably house martins and swifts, and the reason I put that up is because I'm bringing it back to the purpose of tonight's meeting and the Parish Forum. We're aware of, for example, work that's going on in some of the parishes, particularly Hebden. There is the Sedbergh Swift community group that's doing good work, and there's new groups being set up in Swaledale, and we're hoping that we can set up some more of these across the national park and look at ways we can conserve some of the things like swifts and house martins. So the last slide is really bringing it back to what the ask might be, or what we can maybe have a discussion about how parish councils could help with all this. The first thing I would say is that parish councils are obviously made up of members of the local community, including farmers. You'll have the ear of your local landowners. So you could be a good signposting way of drawing people's attention to the nature recovery plan. We're going to make most of our gains through landscape scale initiatives, which will necessarily involve landowners, moorland owners, farmers. But there is something that every resident of a national park can do. It might be sympathetic management of small areas in the local villages. Might be better management of road verges. And some of that land will be owned by parish councils. And again, I come back to Hebden Parish Council as an example. They have, I know for a fact, done some work on their land where the local beck flows through to improve the quality of the beck, and that's paying off because we've had reports come to us that now the beck is recovering with brown trout, which is good news. And the parish council is already on with plans to create a new community orchard, and both of those projects have been funded through the Swindon Quarry Natural Environment Fund, which is a small fund that we've gained through planning gain through an extension to Swindon Quarry. It covers 13 parishes in the area around Cracoe. And I think there are at least 2 parish councils on this call tonight that, or 3 that could benefit from that fund. We've set up, there is another Dry Rig Quarry Natural Environment Fund that is focused on 10 parishes around the Horton area. And again, there's a possibility there that could be accessed by at least 2 of the parish councils on the call tonight. So, and I'm hoping that through this, and there's also the Sustainable Development Fund I should mention, I'm hoping that we could look at means of through biodiversity net gain, through planning gain, we could actually set up similar funds covering other parts of the national park. Because sadly at the moment, it's only those 23 parishes that are eligible for those natural environment funds. But they're there, parish councils can bid into them, and hopefully residents and other community groups out there can get the funding they need and the resources to help with the nature recovery plan. And that's basically all I wanted to do, and I hope that's been a useful introduction to it, and I'm willing to answer questions, any questions that people might have.